on the North Korea crisis, its causes and cures. You may have noticed the large camera and the good-looking fellow behind the camera there. You might deduce that we're on the record. We're actually live on C-SPAN 1, I'm told. So this should be a good session. I'm honored to be accompanied by two good friends here that have some experience with North Korea and can share their insights and their conclusions on it. To my right, Ambassador Joe DeTrani, career intelligence official, fluent in Mandarin, former special envoy to the six-party talks. He was the U.S. representative to the Korean Economic Development Agency, associate director of national intelligence and mission manager for North Korea, and director of the National Counterproliferation Center, and special advisor to the director of national intelligence. So he's been trying to make sense of this problem to a lot of people for a long time, and he's able to speak well about this. To my left, Greg Scarlatoiu. He's executive director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, which induces a lot of interesting conversations. He was formerly with the Korean Economic Institute in Washington, and he comes to his knowledge of communist governments honestly. He was raised in Romania during the Ceausescu regime, so he's got a decided view on this. And I'd like to start off with Greg, and then we'll shift to Joe, and then, as usual, we'll go to questions from the assembled group. Thank you.
John Gregson, thank you, sir, for the kind introduction. 28 years after the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, the Kim regime is still around. Not only has this regime survived, it has developed a lot of terrifying weapons in the meantime and achieved two hereditary transmissions of power from grandfather Kim Il-sung to son Kim Jong-il in July 1994, and from son Kim Jong-il to grandson Kim Jong-un in December 2011. How did we get here? One argument that is made explaining the resilience of the Kim regime is the fact that Eastern Europeans had witnessed other political systems, good, bad, terrible. In the case of North Korea, the regime of Kim Il-sung, his system, is truly the result of the fusion of three totalitarian political systems. Of course, there is Stalinist communism, then Japanese imperialism. After all, from 1905 to 1945, Korea was under a very tough, brutal Japanese imperial occupation. Prior to that, 500 years of feudal Joseon dynasty. So one argument that is made is that this dynastic dictatorship of the Kim family regime is truly the result of the fusion of three totalitarian political systems. What we know for sure is that this is a criminal regime, and in February 2014, a UN Commission of Inquiry submitted a report, the result of a year-long investigation, submitted a report to the Human Rights Council, a report that found that what is happening in North Korea, in particular at the North Korean political prison camps, amounts to crimes against humanity. None of us have a perfect human rights record. Many of us in the free world work hard on improving that record. There is only one country on the face of the planet where there are still political prison camps, and that is North Korea. Currently, there are 120,000 men, women, and children being held at North Korea's political prison camps, up to 3 generations of the same family, pursuant to a system of guilt by association called Yonja-je, a system of feudal inspiration. This is the only country on the face of the planet that classifies its own citizens based on their perceived degree of loyalty to the regime. The names are frightening. There is a core class, 20 to 25% of the population. There is a wavering class, 40 to 60% of the population. There is a hostile class, 20 to 25% of the population. Many of those classified as hostile have been sent to political prison camps. Many of them have been banished to remote areas in the northeastern part of North Korea. The abuse happening at North Korea's detention facilities is absolutely unbelievable. We've had numerous accounts of public secret execution, starvation. The prisoners are subjected to a vicious cycle of forced labor and induced malnutrition. One can truly see this vast system of unlawful imprisonment as truly the heart of darkness of the North Korean regime. So going back to the question as to how this regime has managed to stay in power for so long. After all, next year they will be celebrating the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the DPRK. As General Gregson very kindly mentioned earlier, I was born and raised in communist Romania, which was the one Eastern European country that came closest to Kim Il-sung's North Korea. The two leaders, Ceausescu and Kim Il-sung, were good friends. Now, certainly Romania was a very oppressive regime, and some of us, or all of us, still remember the notorious secret police, the Securitate. For a population of 23 million in 1989, the Securitate, the secret police, had 14,000 agents. For a similar population of 25 million in North Korea today, there are 270,000 agents of North Korea's main internal security agencies. The State Security Department, the SSD, if you will, this is the North Korean Stasi or Gestapo, the SSD has 50,000 agents. The Ministry of Public Security, their police force, of course it's a police force that executes political police functions as well, 210,000, and the Military Security Command, whose mission is to keep an eye on officers, senior officers in particular, 10,000 agents. In Romania, there are 500,000 informers, which is a stain on the honor of the nation. In North Korea, each and every individual has to become an informer and report on family, friends, neighbors. Each and every North Korean has to participate in the Imminban Neighborhood Watch system. Each and every North Korean has to participate in weekly indoctrination sessions where people confess to their trespasses. They engage in a robust session of self-criticism, pledging to strengthen their ideological prowess. Others criticize them, and this goes on and on and on. Truly, the life of a North Korean is lived under an overwhelming level of coercion, control, surveillance, and punishment, which means that the level of social cohesion is very low. It's very difficult for people to get together, to organize and discuss sports even, forget about politics. North Korea, although the situation has changed to a certain extent, and I will mention that in just a few minutes, North Korea continues to restrict very severely information coming into the country and also information getting out of the country. If one thinks of Budapest 1956, Prague 1968, Bucharest 1989, what was the age of the revolution? Late teens, early 20s, perhaps mid-20s. At the age of the revolution, each and every young man in North Korea is in a military uniform for 10 years, age 17 to age 27. Also, many of the women spend 6 years in a military uniform. I have spoken with numerous North Koreans whose sons had come back from the military after having spent 10 years in the KPA. They all said that although they had lived under this permanent indoctrination by the Kim regime, the level of indoctrination that their sons had been subjected to was frightening, even to a North Korean living in North Korea. By the time they're out of the military, the age of revolution has already passed. Of course, I would be stating and restating the obvious if I said that North Korea today is different from North Korea 10 or 20 years ago. As we all remember, in the mid to late 1990s, between 600,000 and 3 million North Koreans starved to death or died of disease induced by malnutrition. This happened, the main reason behind this great tragedy that affected the people of North Korea was that while international aid was coming in, the Kim regime chose to focus its resources on its fundamental strategic objective that I know Ambassador DeTrani will mention later, which is, of course, as we all know by now, survival. Of course, this regime does not want its people to die by the millions, but if that is what it takes in order to stay in power, it will do it in the blink of an eye. And this is what happened in the 1990s. Ever since, if I may say so, there have been some positive side effects. First and foremost, many more North Koreans have escaped the country. As of a couple of weeks ago, there were 30,800 North Korean defectors living in South Korea. There are 220 North Korean defectors here in the United States. They're elsewhere. They have played an extraordinarily important role. Through them, we have learned the stories of North Korea. Through them, we have learned the truth about what is happening in North Korea. And after all, I will take the liberty of saying that the work that organizations such as ours do is the work that the Kim regime fears the most. We find out the truth and we tell the truth about North Korea. Of course, this regime does care about its pocketbook, and it also cares about its legitimacy. If we bring up nuclear weapons once, we should bring up human rights 5 times. Every time we address nuclear weapons, I'm not exactly an avid reader of the Nodong Shinmun, but I do read it every day. It's pretty similar. It doesn't take that much time. Nuclear weapons have become an essential part of the very identity of this regime. It fills up pages and pages of propaganda with articles about their nuclear capabilities. Nuclear weapons are in their constitution, and every time we mention human rights at the UN or other international fora, this results in undermining the legitimacy of the regime. I think that one has to keep in mind that, yes, indeed, the fundamental objective of this regime is survival. But this is an absolute monopoly on power. Inside North Korea, there are no competitors. It is the Kim regime and only the Kim regime. The Kim regime's main competitor is South Korea, free, democratic, prosperous Republic of Korea. As preposterous as this may sound, this regime understands that the only long-term guarantee of its own survival is to establish hegemony over the entire Korean peninsula. Have we seen any positive developments in recent years for the past 2 decades? Basically, during the days of Kim Il-sung, the Kim regime attempted to demonetize the economy by replacing money as a means of exchange with rations. During the days of the Great Famine, the regime was no longer able to feed its people through the PDS, the public distribution system. Small markets were established, so ever since, for the past 2 decades, we have seen a process of informal marketization in North Korea. There are farmers' markets, black markets, open markets. Many more people depend on the markets today than they do on the public distribution system, which is still active for those living in the capital city of Pyongyang. Those elites, most of North Korea's elites live in the capital city of Pyongyang. You will see pictures of buildings actually constructed on Kim Jong-un's watch. They're quite impressive, one might say. And of course, I also have the memories of Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania, where there was a lot of construction, but very little economic utility to that construction. The regime of Kim Jong-un has invested heavily in these high-profile projects, such as buildings in the capital city of Pyongyang. At the same time, if one takes a look at pictures from 1 year ago, if you remember Typhoon Lion Rock affected North Korea quite seriously, I vividly remember pictures published in North Korea's propaganda, pictures of men participating in recovery efforts. They had no tools, not a shovel, not a hammer, forget about tractors, forget about trucks. This is how the regime of Kim Jong-un operates, by concentrating, focusing all resources first and foremost on those aspects that are critical to its survival and not on the ordinary people of North Korea. Speaking of the markets, of course, not having to depend on the public distribution system, the regime not being able to absolutely control its own people through the distribution of food is certainly a positive development. The other positive development induced by the markets is that social dynamics are somehow changing in North Korea, slowly but surely. In the past, prior to the famine, life used to be centered on two places: the workplace and the place of residence. The workplace is always assigned. Nobody gets to choose it in North Korea. The place of residence is assigned by the workplace. Of course, on paper, everyone has to be employed in North Korea. Everyone has to punch in, punch out. Men have to participate in a lot of public mobilization campaigns. That's primarily why women are the main actors involved in North Korea's markets. But going back to social dynamics, this is not a society that thrives on trust. Actually, deep distrust is everywhere. However, since there is nowhere to lend or borrow money, there are no banks available to those active at these markets, all of these market transactions, basically goods coming from China, they're sold at wholesale markets in the border areas, then at wholesale markets in the provinces, then at retail markets. Most of these transactions are executed based on trust. So perhaps one very interesting development that will again take time in North Korea is that a bit of trust, more than before, is developing in personal relationships. That is not to say that the regime of Kim Jong-un is less of a human rights denier than that of the father or the grandfather. And my organization, the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, HRNK, has identified several trends in human rights under the Kim Jong-un regime. We have identified these trends based on a research methodology that comprises satellite imagery, testimony by defectors inside the country, and in this day and age, given technological advances that we can benefit from, we even have access to sources inside the country. We have all heard about the purge that has been going on in North Korea since early 2009, when the Kim regime began proceeding with preparations for the second hereditary transmission of power, according to a Seoul-based think tank staffed with a lot of senior North Korean defectors, INSS, the Institute for National Security Strategy. During the first 5 years of the Kim Jong-un regime, 340 senior officials were purged or executed. Remember, this is a humongous bureaucracy. It's more than one individual. It's the entire bureaucratic support structure that's taken out from underneath. It's friends, associates, family, colleagues. The favorite method of execution on Kim Jong-un's watch is execution by ZPU-4 anti-aircraft machine gun system. HRNK managed to acquire a satellite image of such an execution taken just minutes before. You're talking about a machine gun system, 4 machine gun barrels, 50 caliber, automatic fire. Human bodies are just pulverized. They're turned into pink mist. Remember, this is still a Confucian society. Of course, the old elites were exterminated. People of religion were exterminated. Christians were exterminated. New elites were created. It's still a Confucian mindset, and these officials who are executed are even denied the fundamental right of leaving a body behind. North Korea is a member of the United Nations, thus bound by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has ratified several human rights instruments, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Women's Convention, the Children's Convention, and yet each and every conceivable human right is violated in North Korea. North Korea has zero diplomatic credibility, given all of the engagements that it has broken. As far as we're concerned, human rights organizations, we will continue to tackle the toughest issues first, and the most difficult of all issues in North Korea is surely its vast system of unlawful imprisonment, North Korea's political prison camp system, and if I may use the same terminology, what we aim for, what we want to see, is the complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's gulag. Thank you very much.
On that happy note, let me turn to Ambassador DeTrani. First time you and I met, we were talking about complete, verifiable.
That's exactly right.
And we're still talking about it.
Still talking about it. Thank you, General Gregson, and the Center for the National Interest. Thank you for the invitation. This is a very, obviously a very important subject, one that's being discussed as we speak at the United Nations at the General Assembly meeting. And our President will be speaking to the General Assembly tomorrow to include North Korea. Let me just follow up on what Greg's outstanding presentation was focused on, and that's human rights, criminality, illicit behavior. Let me just follow up on that, and then I'll go into what I really would like to get a little more deeply into. You know, in September 2005, we had a joint statement agreement with North Korea, 19 September to be exact. And it took a number of years to come up with this joint statement. And the joint statement speaks to North Korea, and that's the father, Kim Jong-il, committing to comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of all their nuclear programs. And we made that very clear to the North Koreans, and in return for that, they would be getting the security assurances, economic development assistance, eventually the provision of light water reactors when they return to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. We made it very clear to North Korea that that wasn't a sine qua non for normalization of relations. And I remember many discussions, or at least a few, where the North Koreans said, wait a minute, if we denuclearize comprehensively, you're saying that doesn't lend itself immediately to normal relations with the United States, because this indeed was, and I believe still is, their major objective, normalizing relations with the United States. And I said, no, there are other issues. These are bilateral issues. The work, and it would be actions for actions. It wouldn't be immediate denuclearization, but as North Korea denuclearized, moved towards denuclearization, they would get the benefits, to include certainly security assurances. Eventually peace treaty, et cetera. But we said then there are bilateral issues. With Japan, there's a lot of human rights issues, but indeed the abductee issue, very powerful. Separated families in South Korea. And for the United States, further to Greg's comments, human rights. We need transparency on your human rights issues. We need to see some progress on what you're doing on human rights, because that's part of our value system. and for us to have normal relations with the country, those are important elements. The illicit activities, the counterfeiting of a $100 note, counterfeiting pharmaceuticals, cigarettes. This is criminal behavior that we need to see progress, indeed elimination, but indeed progress, transparency and progress towards that. And then that would lend itself. So then these become bilateral discussions. But the opening up to permit these bilateral discussions would be, again, that September 2005 joint statement where North Korea committed to complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement for those deliverables that are important for North Korea. So I couldn't agree with you more, Greg, on the human rights issue. And that's always been a strong core element of our dialogue with North Korea, that the nuclear gets us into the core issues that touch our values as a nation, and indeed other nations at the table, South Korea, Japan, certainly their allies, Russia and China. That's September 2005. Let me go back a few years, because it took us about 2 years to get to that point, because the first meeting of the six-party talks was in August of 2003. And I remember that vividly because in April of 2003, we were at a very tense point with North Korea, a tipping point. North Korea was reprocessing spent fuel rods they took out of cooling ponds from the Yongbyon facility. It was the end of the agreed framework. They pulled out of the NPT. They were reprocessing spent fuel rods for nuclear weapons. They made it very clear. They told us. You didn't have to do much intelligence on these issues. They tell you. And they were doing that. And it was our Secretary of State who went to his counterpart in Beijing, Li Jiaxing, and said, look, this is getting very tense. And the Chinese spoke to the North Koreans, and that was a dialogue that happened in April of 2005, which established the six-party process. So the North Koreans came to the table with China, the United States. We discussed it, and it was the beginning of the six-party process. The first meeting I mentioned was in August. I remember one of my first meetings at the six-party talks was a statement that rings very true today, as it did in 2003, where North Korea very candidly said, you know, Mr. DeTrani, accept the fact that we will be a nuclear weapon state. Why don't you, the Americans need to understand that and accept that. And we could be a good friend of the United States if you accept that. And look at Pakistan, the relationship you have with Pakistan. They put that on the table. And ladies and gentlemen, they've not walked away from that issue. And as Greg indicated, it's part of their constitution now, is Byongjin, economic development and a nuclear weapon state. And they're pursuing that. That has been their goal. And the sense one has, and let me just go back to the 2005 joint statement, that fell apart at the end of 2008 for a very clear reason. We expected our monitors, who were going to monitor and verify their adherence to the commitments to denuclearize, move towards that they wouldn't permit them off of Yongbyon. Orally, we had the commitment. We wanted it in writing. They wouldn't put it in writing, and that was the beginning of the end. We said, if you can't put that in writing, we can't have our monitors who are going to verify compliance with this joint statement, then we really don't have anything here. We don't have the trust, and so forth. And that was the beginning of the end of the joint statement. As it was, we scroll way back to 1994 with the agreed framework. The end of that was in 2002 when North Korea was confronted with the uranium enrichment program, which they tacitly admitted to having, basically telling our representatives in Pyongyang that we have this and we have other things, and basically there's not much you can do about it. So it speaks to North Korea, even with the agreed framework and the light water reactors that were being built and the heavy fuel oil provided, they still wanted a second path to nuclear weapons. And even then in 2005, when we had the joint statement, the sense was that they weren't committed to let the monitors, if they were totally in compliance, leave Yongbyon to confirm other areas. So there were pieces there that speak to where we are today in 2017. 25 years of negotiations. And we've had the agreed framework, we've had the joint statement, but we've also had the Perry process, where we had our former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, in Pyongyang, meeting with Kim Jong-il. We had their Vice Marshal Joe in the White House meeting with our president. We had some significant developments, but they eventually all fell apart, as it is right now. As we've experienced over this past year with over 16 missile launches, intercontinental ballistic missile, 2 intermediate range ballistic missiles. Now the ICBMs that have a reach of Denver, Chicago, we're touching the United States. IRBMs that have a reach, we're talking about 4,000 to 6,000 kilometers that could reach Guam. We've heard that. We've heard Kim Jong-un speak about that. Submarine launched ballistic missiles. We've seen the 6th nuclear test, a very significant nuclear test, because North Korea claims it was a thermonuclear event. It was a hydrogen bomb, thermonuclear. Very, very significant, ladies and gentlemen, we all know that. And the sense is that they've miniaturized their nuclear warheads and then they're in the process of mating them. And it's a question of being at the cusp, ensuring that that reentry vehicle will not burn up when they re-enter the atmosphere. And at that point, they become an existential nuclear threat to the United States, as they've been an existential nuclear threat to South Korea and Japan for the last number of years. This is a critical issue. So our president and all others are right on the mark, saying we're at a tipping point. This is an issue. But it's a North Korea also that is pursued very vigorously, and we saw that with Sony Pictures. Our allies in South Korea saw it with the banking system, the cyber capabilities, chemical capabilities, biological capabilities, looking at asymmetrical, in addition to the conventional weapons that they have sitting on the Kaesong Heights that are looking at Seoul, South Korea. We're talking about a very tense period. I mentioned 2003 when they were reprocessing spent fuel rods. Think of where we are right now, when the assessment is up to 40 nuclear warheads. Some say 40 to 60. Some say by 2020 they could have 100 nuclear warheads that are miniaturized with the delivery systems. And this is a North Korea that has sold nuclear technology to countries like Syria. We saw this in Al-Kabar when the Israelis in 2007, September 2007, took out Al-Kabar. It was a nuclear facility, plutonium, nuclear facility that the North Koreans were assisting with. We've seen it with their missile transfers to Iran, Libya, Syria. This was to make money. And this is what keeps their nuclear program going, their missile program going, getting the revenue necessary to sustain those programs. So that's why I'm a believer in sanctions, and I think we all are at the United Nations. Will sanctions resolve the nuclear issue? Will sanctions get North Korea to denuclearize comprehensively, verifiably, irreversibly? I think some of us, and I'm one of them, say no, but sanctions bite, and it touches them. And I think that the last Security Council resolution was a very powerful one. About 30% of their, if you will, refined and of the crude oil that comes into North Korea is being restricted. Basically, the textiles, they can't sell. We're talking about up to $750 million, textiles, et cetera. So it does bite, but will it stop them? No. But we need to be doing things. Our joint military exercises, these are irritants to North Korea. They maintain our joint military exercises with our allies in South Korea. Not only are irritants, but they're a prelude to an invasion, the decapitation of the leadership. And what we say for decades, we've had these joint military exercises, which are defensive. And when you say, why defensive? When you look back, you can go back to 1966 when they attacked they had a commando group going at the Blue House in Seoul, Korea. We could go back to Burma, 1983, when they had a commando team that went in to take down the leadership of South Korea that was visiting Burma at that time. Korean Airlines, 1988, the Seoul Olympics. So there are a number of issues which speak to, yes, why defensive? Certainly Chung'an, taking down a frigate, 47 sailors in 2010. Yes, joint defensive military exercise with our South Korean allies. That's why, for many of us who've been working in it, I think almost all of us in this room would say, It's very distasteful for China and Russia to put on the table the cessation of these joint military exercises with our allies in South Korea if we want North Korea to halt, to freeze their missile launches and nuclear tests. We're saying, yeah, it's not comparable. It's not comparable. Those missile launches and nuclear tests are in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and they're one of the 193 nations in the United Nations. We're saying no. About what our Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, has said very clearly, the U.S. is prepared to sit down with North Korea and talk about these issues and hear their concerns, but they need to hear our concerns, our allies' concerns. But we don't want to do that with a gun to our head. We don't want to do that while they're launching missiles and having nuclear tests. Stop what you're doing, and if we have exploratory talks that go on for one day, we'll have them, then you stop for one day. If they go on for a week, stop for a week. If they go on for 3 months, but at least have some timelines. And during those exploratory talks, make a decision whether it would be possible to reconstitute negotiations with North Korea, certainly to include our allies, China, Russia, and maybe expand it. Maybe expand it. So, but is that possible? So exploratory talks, not while North Korea is launching missiles or having nuclear tests. That's been put on the table by our secretary, which is I think a very progressive proposal, unconditional. And it's not a condition to stop nuclear tests and missile launches while you're talking to your interlocutor. I mean, that's called common courtesy. You're doing that, and where you're going. Now, North Korea has not taken up on that. We've not accepted a freeze for a freeze. And we've seen where North Korea is going with their ICBMs. As I mentioned, they're at the cusp of getting what they want, and that's the ability to deliver an intercontinental ballistic missile to the United States and ensuring that reentry visit. Now, I could mention, I say, ensuring that reentry vehicle does not sort of burn up on reentry. That's looking at a best case scenario. That's a scientific approach. You want to test, so there'll be more tests to ensure you could do that. But doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. Doesn't mean they're going to just test it to wait it. So when we hear the president say, all options are on the table, that's pretty understandable. You have a country that in 1 year has had more missile launches than the last, 10, that has had what it looks like a thermonuclear event, test. We're talking about over 100, 120, 150 kiloton event. And China's seeing this with the fallout on that event here. And we're seeing a country that it's not tethered. It's not tethered. I mean, his uncle, Jang Sung-tak, was executed, as Greg explained it a minute ago, with those anti-aircraft weapons. His half-brother in Kuala Lumpur International Airport, VX nerve agent. What are we talking about here, ladies and gentlemen? I don't doubt that Kim Jong-un is a rational actor from where he sits, but from where we sit, we have to be very mindful of the threat he poses to our allies and to the United States and globally, regionally and certainly globally. Because there's another piece to nuclear weapons, and we all know that because I mentioned Al-Kabar a minute ago. And I mentioned the illicit activities to make money. Certainly, nuclear weapons in North Korea, and this is I think, why many, and I'm certainly one of them, maintain accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapon state would be a disaster. It would be a disaster. Because we are going to get regional nuclear proliferation on that. Certainly South Korea, Japan, even Taiwan, others. They're not just going to sit there. We have an extended nuclear deterrence commitment to our allies. They know that. But the fact of the matter is, with North Korea retaining those nuclear weapons, I think there will be an impetus, and we see some of this now, to get your own deterrent capability, our own nuclear deterrent capability. And that's a reality, and when you look at that. But there's also another reality of miscalculation, misinformation, confusion, or the sale of the proliferation issue, ladies and gentlemen. Proliferation issue. That plutonium nuclear reactor in Al-Kabar in Syria that was taken out in 2007, there's no doubt in my mind there was money transacted in that. And now the possibility of nuclear weapons, fissile material out there, accidentally, purposefully, what have you. This is not where we want to go. So let me end on this point. When the president says all these options are on the table, I mentioned Secretary of State Rex Tillerson offering exploratory talks to determine if negotiations can be reconstituted. Seems very fair. Just don't launch missiles and have nuclear tests while we're having these discussions. Seems reasonable. North Korea is not there. In my view, they're not there because they want to prove that they have that capability of being a real existential nuclear threat to the U.S., but that's okay, it's there. And the other option there is they have these missiles and these nuclear warheads, and they have the vitriolic statements that come out of Pyongyang. Again, like in 1993, making Seoul a sea of ashes, in this case, making the United States a sea of ashes. YouTubes depicting the if you will, the nuclear event going on in New York or Washington and so forth, or Seoul or Tokyo and what have you. Preemptive strikes. Indeed, if there's a missile launch, which is viewed as an imminent threat to the United States or an ally, I think it's pretty clear, certainly to me and I believe to people in this room here, that not only is this something we should do, we have an obligation to protect our nation, our people, our allies, their people, if it's an imminent threat. International law, there's no ambiguity in that. If there's an imminent threat, you have that not only authority, obligation to do something. To me, that's a preemptive strike. If there's a missile launch, and North Korea has to understand this very, very clearly, there's no way the U.S. is just going to sit here with our allies and watch that. That's why we have missile defense out there. That's why we have the joint military exercises. That's why sanctions are trying to compel or at least convince North Korea to cease their missile launches and nuclear tests and so forth. So far, to no avail, but they will continue. But preemptive going after a launch of that nature makes eminent sense. And North Korea has to understand that. With the declaratory policy, if you react to that in an untoward way, there'll be further consequences on that and so forth. So all options are on the table, which makes this a very critical period for all those reasons. So let me just end on this. Although nuclear weapons are part of the Constitution Byongjin with economic development, and we see the markets, the private markets and so forth, because the public distribution system isn't working. Nuclear weapons are there, economic development's there, and so forth. The opportunity now to come back, because if North Korea is still committed and still wants very dearly to have normal relations with the United States, which they said they wanted in 2003, my personal view, having met with the North Koreans and continue to meet with them informally, is they do want a normal relationship with the United States. They do, but they want it on their terms. Accept us as a nuclear weapon state, and we will behave. And in fact, we'll be a good, they said that past, and I believe that's the case right now, and I've heard that over close to a year ago when I met with some of them. We will be a good friend of the United States, but the fact of the matter is no. We're saying you could be a good friend of the United States and our allies if you behave, and it doesn't come with nuclear weapons, and it doesn't come with illicit activities, and it doesn't come with abusive human rights violations. Thank you.
Well, Joe, Greg, thank you for the presentations. I think we can all tell that not only is there deep experience with North Korea sitting here at the front table, but there is deep emotion attached to this. We'll open it up for questions now. I'll put the reminder out again. We are on the record. Matter of fact, we're on TV. I would ask if you want to ask a question, make a comment, let me know somehow, and tell us who you are and what your affiliation is, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much. Sir.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. My name is Ben Lowson. I'm an Asia strategist for the U.S. Navy. Much has been made about Mr. Kim being a rational actor, and I'd just like to consider the other side of the coin, because looking at his domestic program of economic development, we can say he talks a big game, but he's been an abject failure. So what does this do to his mentality? Does this have an effect at all, or do they just not care?
Well, let me just start on that. I think he would view himself as not a failure. I think he would view himself as a significant success, and he's looking for a legacy as a young man at 33, 34, He's establishing North Korea with nuclear as a nuclear weapon state, the 9th nuclear weapon state. He probably feels he's at the cusp of getting others to recognize and accept. That's the word, accept. We realized what he has, but accept that he is a nuclear weapon state, so he's at the table. So he feels he's on the cusp, and I think that plays a little into the economic issue that Greg so eloquently spoke about, where he's permitting those private plots and those private markets, almost reminiscent of China in the 70s with the Cultural Revolution coming out of the Great Leap, to let that go on because the public distribution isn't doing it. So I think Kim Jong-un is feeling pretty good about himself right now. Greg?
And given that we've seen this massive purges, practically all 4 fundamental building blocks of the Kim regime have been purged: the military, the Korean People's Army, the party, the internal security agencies, and even the inner core of the Kim family, as Ambassador DeTrani mentioned earlier. Both the uncle, Chung Song-taek, executed with a ZPU-4, the half-brother assassinated with a VX nerve agent at a busy international airport in Kuala Lumpur. Those around Kim Jong-un will be afraid to deliver bad news to the supreme leader, and this might result in miscalculation. Kim Jong-un not being able to accurately assess those accomplishments that he's so keen on along the Pyongyang policy line.
Yes, sir, against the wall, back in the rear.
Hi, my name's Gardner Harris with the New York Times. The preemptive war was mentioned, of course, in the situation where the United States thought an immediate threat was coming, but there has also been talk about preemptive war to simply deny North Korea its ability to strike the United States with an ICBM. Do either one of you think that that's a realistic option? What would that scenario look like? How many people would die in South Korea, elsewhere, and you know, is that realistic?
Greg, if I could start, and then I'll pass it to you, and certainly General Gregson. The term I was using was preemptive, and that would be a preemptive strike against an imminent threat. And I emphasize imminent threat to the United States or an ally. Going left of that would be a preventive strike to prevent them from having the capability of doing anything untoward, of threatening the U.S. or an ally. A preventive strike on that. Personally, I think with the preemptive and a declaratory policy, North Korea and the vitriolic statements and the missile launches they've had, successful ones, and the nuclear tests they had, I think anyone who's advising Kim Jong-un, if there are some advising him, and I think he would understand that the U.S. will not just sit there and is obligated, and we will just not sit there to permit that to happen. If there's an imminent threat, something will be done to intercept, to destroy that threat. And that's the preemption side. Preventing is going into North Korea to prevent them even from having that capability to threaten an ally or the United States. And I think on the preemption side, Kim Jong-un would have to be very cautious on how he responds. He may do it through cyber. He may do it on the northern limit line, where we saw with the Chung'an. He may do something, but he needs to understand he's provoking a response, a necessary response, and so forth. Preventive side, going less of that, where you're going in and going after infrastructure to deny the capability of even threatening and so forth, is something else. And I think Kim Jong-un then becomes more of of his own player. He becomes more of an actor whom we really can't understand his reaction to. My personal view on that would be he and his military people would react in a very significant way. It wouldn't be a moderated way. It would be probably more indicative of the fact that they feel they've been threatened significantly and attacked in a way. Now, having said that, I think Kim Jong-un and those advising him have to understand he's at the point now where others would make the case that you can't just wait for an imminent threat, because that imminent threat, which would have to be dealt with, are you waiting too long? Do you have to, if you know eventually there will be an imminent threat, do you have to respond beforehand to prevent that from happening? And I think that's the issue right now, where we're going into a different category of not just prevention, but prevention from from an actor who possibly or likely would be doing something of an imminent nature that would threaten us or our allies.
Chip, would you have something to say on that?
Yeah, let me try and add something on this also. Since at least 1993, we've gone through the same cycle of options every time North Korea acts out, and it's caused Victor Cha, who's a great analyst of this situation, to characterize North Korea as a land of lousy options. One is preemptive attack, and then we decide that that's too costly. The next is negotiations and agreements. Korea cheats on those. And then there's sanctions. We always seem to settle on sanctions as the safe resort. But I think there's an argument that if sanctions are truly effective, then they, by definition, are affecting the stability and the longevity of the regime. So you get to another very risky situation. Another interesting question to contemplate is that our allies, the Republic of Korea and Japan, have been under an existential threat for quite some time. We are now fully exercised because of the imminence of an existential threat to the United States. So it induces a question of if our allies are to continue to believe in our guarantees of extended deterrence, what do we do to make sure that they believe this is rock solid? I think there's a case to be made that the onset of a ballistic missile nuclear threat to the United States fundamentally changes things, to say the least. So we need to take other actions to shore up our deterrence in the Far East. And it's been most famously stated, including to the Chinese, that if you cannot or you will not help us to restrain North Korea, then we, the United States, have no other alternative but to enhance our alliance capabilities. You may find that destabilizing, but this is not about you. This is about our U.S. vital interest, and we are going to stand by our allies, and that means moving capabilities there and enhancing our alliance capabilities to guarantee that we're doing the best we can to protect our allies against this same threat that we find so discomforting to the United States. There are no easy answers to this thing, but Greg mentioned earlier, one thin thread of an answer. Greg mentioned earlier about more information getting into North Korea. It's interesting that in the wake of the Cheonan sinking and the shelling of Yongpyong-do, there was a very large degree of political unrest in South Korea. They were angry at their government for not having any response options to provocations. So provocation options were developed. The next incident was the placement of landmines on the southern side of the DMZ that maimed some Republic of Korea soldiers. The option the ROK chose to employ to retaliate for that deadly force incident was to turn the loudspeakers on the DMZ back on, broadcasting information into North Korea. The North Koreans reacted really vigorously. This bothered them. From a small wedge, maybe there's a crack we can develop here. More and more information getting into North Korea may be one of the hopes we have for change. Greg spoke eloquently about human rights, so did Joe. One of the strongest suits we have is pushing that, because we're speaking to populations by going right past their leadership in an autocratic society. That's a neat trick. We're the country that stared down the Soviet Union over decades. Deterrence may be, amongst all the military options available, strengthening our deterrence may be the best option. but remains to be seen. Go ahead.
And General Gregson, if I may add to that, when it comes to information campaigns, I think that true change, as difficult to imagine as it might be, true change can only come from the people of North Korea themselves. We need to tell them three fundamental stories. The story of the outside world, especially the story of free, prosperous, democratic South Korea, the story of the corruption of their own leadership, in particular the Kim family regime, and the story of their own human rights situation, which they do not necessarily understand living under such an oppressive regime.
Marvin Ott, please make sense of this. Help us out.
Thank you. Very good as always, informative and really interesting. I guess what's bothering me is a very rich laydown of the dilemmas, not a whole lot in terms of actionable solutions. If I'm called into Admiral Harris's office or H.R. McMaster's office or General Mattis's office and said, okay, what the hell do we do? I'm still casting about. And just to sort of 30 seconds where it strikes me, a lot of talk about preemptive strikes of one sort or another. I wonder if that barn is, if that horse is out of the barn, it's too late. Because with the number of nuclear weapons that the North has now that are usable, it doesn't take much imagination to even see a very quote unquote successful preemptive strike on the missile installations and all of that, creating a desperate sort of we'll bring the house down around us mentality, and you start having nuclear weapons going off in South Korea. I mean, the level of carnage and damage that's fully credible under any military scenario, it strikes me as just off the charts. And if the military scenario is viable at all, it's probably viable for a few weeks. I mean, at what point do the North Koreans announce they've mastered the reentry shielding? They can now bring a missile down on New York City, and they'll demonstrate it with a shot that our people can read, examine, and say, yes, they've achieved that. At that point, it's over in terms, it strikes me, in terms of a preemptive strike. So what you're left with is either basically cutting a deal very much on Kim Jong-un's terms of, okay, we will give you certain recognition and so on, in the name of preventing some absolute catastrophe, or you end up with, which I think is where General Gregson was going, with a mutual assured destruction, heavy investment in missile defense, and basically hunker down and essentially present Kim Jong-un with the message, okay, you've been successful, you developed all these systems, they aren't strategically worth much because we now have credible defensive capabilities that we can basically neutralize it. And that's the sort of the only avenue left, strikes me.
Can I just comment on that? I think those are good points, and General Gregson right on. North Korea makes it very clear that their nuclear, and they use the terminology nuclear deterrent, that they're building their nuclear deterrent. And they've made it very clear since 2003 when they got on this path of building nuclear weapons, that their nuclear arsenal is for deterrence purposes. And when you're sitting down with them now, we have to look at what they say and what they're doing, but when you sit down with them, they're saying, this vitriolic commentary, this is, hyperbolic rhetoric, shouldn't, no, well, we have to believe what you have. If you're threatening the U.S. and its allies and you're launching missiles and you have nuclear events, and we have to believe that, and we have to take so you're right on, missile defense, joint military exercises, sanctions that are biting, information, secondary sanctions for anyone who's dealing in, and as North Korea becomes more isolated, and that's where the UN comes in and the international community writ large, they become that much more isolated. And what they've done is they've truly alienated China. We haven't mentioned China in this discussion so far. This isn't something that China is very pleased with, obviously, and not only because of the 19th Party Congress coming up next month, but because this man has been, in crude terms, disrespectful to the PRC and to President Xi Jinping, and totally discounts the concerns that are coming there. Now, China has a lot of leverage, and that was the last sanctions. We're talking about the crude oil, over 90% from China, refined oil, 85 to 90% of the trade and so forth. So there is something that we're trying to get them to the table and so forth. So I guess what I'm saying, yeah, we do have that option, as General Gregson said, and I think that's the approach we're taking. But let me just say this. I think many of the analysts who look at North Korea saying, if they launch a missile and they put a nuclear warhead on that, that's the end of the country, and I think they understand that. And as Greg said so well before, survival is key for that nation. However, when you're commander-in-chief and you got to look at the realities, not what your assessment is, and so forth. So we have to consider all those options, all those pieces that are on the table there. So we're and that I guess that's the value then of exploratory. Although most people would say, why negotiations again? We failed after 1994, failed in 2005, 2000 with the Secretary of State's visit, and why would you even consider that? Well, what we want to do is stop the process. I think it's kind of logical. You don't want them having another nuclear test. You don't want them to have another ICBM launched or an IRBM and so forth, because as you just said so correctly, the possibility of miscalculation is there, and that could precipitate something.
You didn't mention your visit to North Korea with Bill Clinton as a negotiation success.
Well, I wasn't but I was involved with the arranging for President Clinton to visit to get the two journalists back. And I think this is something that Kim Jong-il at that time wanted. He wanted a visit of a former president, in fact, that he thought he was making progress with when they had Secretary Albright's visit and Vice Marshal Joe's visit to the White House, and the possibility of a Clinton visit, except for what happened in the Middle East that precluded that, to Pyongyang. And I think that was, so for Kim Jong-il, I think that was an important visit of former President Clinton.
Looks like it was our high point. Yes, ma'am.
Rachel Oswald, Congressional Quarterly. What do you think of the possibility of, or the methods for obtaining deconfliction conversations with China about what to do in the event of any range of incidents in North Korea, both obviously to make sure we don't inadvertently touch off World War III with China, but also as a means of pressuring North Korea? And if you don't think they should be used as a means of pressuring North Korea, should these potential talks with China be kept classified? I mean, obviously classified, but non-public.
Let me just start.
Perfect question.
Good questions. Let me just start. We had our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, who was in China. We've Secretary Mattis, Secretary Rex Tillerson. A lot of discussions with the Chinese on that, and certainly our ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Haley, has been discussing it with her counterpart. A lot of discussions with the Chinese. Certainly the Chinese are not happy with what's been going on with North Korea. So there's a lot going on there, but a lot that's public. I'm sure there's a lot that's not public, and which is encouraging. That's all positive. China pressuring North Korea, I'm not sure if pressure is the right word. I don't think Kim Jong-un responds too well to pressure from China. I think he's showing independence and how he's his own person. But I think China could truly, using economic terms, put that pressure you're mentioning on. Yes, if you cut back on that crude oil going into North Korea, I mean, that's key. And it wasn't coincidental that in 2003, when the North Koreans came to the table for talks with the U.S. to start the six-party process, for whatever reason, they said mechanical reasons, the pipeline from China to North Korea providing the crude oil was inoperative. So there was possibly another incentive. So, yeah, I mean, I think China, my personal view, I think China can get North Korea to the table to have exploratory talks.
Dimitri.
This is a very frustrating topic. We all understand how frustrating it is, because our allies are in danger, we are increasingly in danger, and we are obviously looking for a solution. Unfortunately, international relations like life happen to be a tragedy. Otherwise, we would never die. Otherwise, we always would stay healthy and wealthy. There are situations, sometimes, when there are no good solutions. And I'm thinking about a situation the United States found itself in 1949, 1950s. Using Eisenhower, who is a student of non-proliferation and Soviet nuclear strategy, I'm sure knows a lot about that. The Soviets at first have tested an atomic bomb and then a nuclear bomb. And I don't know, Greg, what you would say about Stalin's regime. Probably it was at least comparable in brutality, right, to what we see today in North Korea. They did not deserve to have a nuclear weapon. And with their conventional superiority in Europe, they hardly really needed a nuclear weapon for defensive purposes. A very strong argument could be made that we have to do something, preventive, preemptive, whatever. And of course, our allies in Europe were as concerned about Stalin as today our allies in Japan and South Korea are concerned about Kim. We didn't do it. And we know why we didn't do it, because we couldn't. We couldn't without an unacceptable risk of major military confrontation in Europe. And the solution was deterrence. It was not a happy solution. It was not a perfect solution. Mr. McCarthy thought, Senator McCarthy thought it was like treason, and was accusing a lot of people, including General Marshall, Secretary Acheson, almost of being traitors. But it just was discovered, and your grandfather has acknowledged that deterrence was the only practical solution available. And if we strengthen deterrence, and today combine deterrence with sanctions, can't we achieve a lot of things we really need? Not everything we want, but what we really need. Can effective deterrence in combination with sanctions satisfy our minimal requirements?
Greg? You want to take a swing at this?
Well, from where I stand, especially since you have made that comparison with Eastern Europe, and certainly this is one possibility that will be on the table, but going back to the content of my presentation earlier today, how do we accept a Kim regime that is doing all of these terrible things to its own people, perhaps on a scale much greater than what was happening during the Stalinist days in the Soviet Union? How can there be any semblance of trust if we were to choose this path of effective deterrence? Would we leave the other issues completely off the table? Would we address them? Would it be done under what context? Perhaps under the context of something along the lines of the Helsinki Accords, but in that case, wouldn't that just simply further legitimize the Kim regime?
So can I just comment? I think that's a thank you, Greg. Very good points, and I don't disagree with you, Doctor. No, I totally agree. I think deterrence is very important. There's always that possibility. We have the extended deterrence commitments to our allies in South Korea and Japan. I think there'll be an impetus there in South Korea and Japan to have their own nuclear weapons capabilities, and I think we see that dialogue starting right now. I think other countries may be saying we need our own deterrence capabilities, because that's the reality. And I think our ability then to not only isolate North Korea, but to watch them closely to ensure there's no proliferation is another issue. So yes, I think that's a possibility. And the negatives on that would be the potential of a nuclear arms race, the potential for proliferation, miscalculation, and what have you. We're looking at the idea when we talk about complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of their nuclear weapons program. North Korea is not there. They're saying they're going to retain their nuclear weapons. And I think all analysts are even saying they're not giving it up. So we're hoping maybe, I think with talks, to stop it and maybe to determine if there is a path to moving forward. There could be the internal path that Greg alludes to or spoke about a minute ago. The truth is we don't know the dynamics within North Korea. I mean, some of these very senior people were eliminated. Why were they eliminated? Were they not loyal? Did they have a different point of view? Did they want to continue to be isolated and be viewed as a pariah state? When the information gets in and they look at their brethren in South Korea, they say, my God, why not us? So there are some other imperatives there that may come to fruition from within the country itself.
Admiral McDivitt.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, Mike McDevitt from Center for Naval Analyses. Last year, I was able to participate in a conference in Europe in which North Korean officials were present. And that's always an experience in and of itself. But one of the comments that caught everybody's attention from the leader of the North Korean delegation was the matter-of-fact assertion and statement that you don't understand, we have the United States deterred. And when you reflect upon that, in fact, I think that probably is right. Over what, 4 decades now, whenever North Korea has done something outrageous, we've never laid a glove on them, nor have the South Koreans to speak of. As a former naval officer, the snatching of the Pueblo comes to mind as one that had, other than posturing, we postured, has never had a consequence. So it's not surprising that North Korea, after all these decades, have come to the judgment that, yeah, indeed, we do have the Americans deterred and the South Koreans for the very good reasons that Dmitry just laid out. The consequences of taking action runs the risk of restarting another Korean War with a terrible loss of life. And so while Joe's argument that trying to get some sort of a negotiation makes perfectly good sense, we ought to not stop talking, it strikes me that we need to also make sure, as best we can, that the North Koreans think that we have them deterred, and through either exercises, a nuclear posture review that undoes the last posture review that tried to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons, and perhaps we talk about what would happen if North Korea uses a nuclear weapon and say it in a way that is not cloaked and ambiguous and language, but is very specific, and those sorts of things to try to make Pyongyang less self-assured. That in fact there would be really, really bad consequences, and spell those out in a way that was unmistakable. To begin the discussion of making sure they understand that we think they are also deterred.
Those are good points.
Hang on. Jim Keith. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Jim Keith. I'm a retired American diplomat and currently a business consultant with the firm McClarty Associates. Joe, just to take this path of deterrence and containment a bit further, what does a U.S. policy of containment and deterrence imply for North Korea's enabler? Or to put it differently, what do you think China has to do now to end up on the right side of containment? And what do you think about the deterrent effects of convincing Pyongyang that we actually are deterring them? Won't those have spillover effects on China, as we're seeing already with THAAD and their reaction to the South Koreans?
No, Jim, I think those are excellent points. I think China, I think many of us agree, on the sanctions side, they need to up their game. It's a big country, we know that, but there are banks and there are entities there that they need to ensure that they are not dealing with North Korea on illicit type transactions to truly implement the sanctions. And so there's no way the U.S. can do that. We've done it with the Bank of Dandong and some others, but this is really China's issue. And when they see the secondary sanctions, I think we have their correct attention, and I don't think anyone sees this as malicious. This is something we need to do to contain North Korea, to ensure that these sanctions are biting and so forth. So no, I think your points are right on. I think what you're getting at, and I think it's really salient. China can't be happy with the enhancing THAAD nuclear missile defense capabilities in the region, joint military exercises that are not only enhanced but that include Japan and possibly Australia, bringing more strategic forces into the region. These are not issues that China wants to see. This goes against this is not what they want. When they're looking at the South China Sea, the East China Sea, they got domestic issues, they got so many things. This is not, so I think many would say this becomes more of an imperative for China to be even more proactive. The sense is they are implementing the coal and some of the other sanctions there, but even more proactive on all aspects to any entity in China dealing with North Korea, but also using the leverage they have, because they do have leverage with 90% of the crude oil, 85% trade, et cetera. They do have leverage with North Korea. Using some of that leverage to get North Korea to, I hate to use the term because I know this is distasteful, when you say this to the North Koreans, to better behave. They don't like that. It's like speaking to a child. They don't like that, better behave, and we'll talk to you if you behave. I think North Korea has to understand it's not a question of behaving, it's a question of threatening your allies, your neighbors, the region, the United States, and that's the behavior we're talking about of a normal nation state. So I agree. I think China continues to be key. We said that right from the get-go. China is key, but what China is telling us, and we're seeing this more now, we have to be more proactive. Strategic patience had its place maybe initially after 2008 when the North Koreans didn't want to sign a verification and monitoring agreement. But I think now the U.S. needs to be much more proactive on that, because leaving North Korea, when you're not talking to the North Koreans, I think if anyone did a study on North Korea, when no one is negotiating, talking to the North Koreans, they're on their own path. They're building more nuclear weapons, they're launching missiles and so on. When you have them at the table, you're sitting down, at least during those periods of time, they're somewhat contained in that regard. So I think there's some value, again, getting back to China using its leverage to get to the table and see where we're going. And then deterrence and all the other things that, Dimitri, you mentioned, and Chip.
And now that we brought up China, it's a perfect invitation for an intervention by Ambassador Roy.
Thank you. I'm actually not going to deal directly with China, although it's part of the problem. Thanks very much for the terrific presentations. You've convincingly established that we're dealing with a very bad regime in North Korea. But you've also convincingly demonstrated that it's probably the most frustrating foreign policy problem we face. Because like frustrating problems, it's generated a lot of nonsense with all sorts of phantasmic concepts of how we can deal with the question, and a refusal in many cases to face up to the reality. The reason why China doesn't provide the convincing answer to it is it's crystal clear that the North Korean nuclear program is designed as a deterrent to the United States, which it sees as the principal threat to it. And we convincingly keep reminding them that we are the principal threat, because we keep putting military options out on the table, either implicitly, as in the Bush administration, where we talked about unilateral action and preemptive action, and currently where we're talking about having military options out there. So we clearly need some additional thinking about this. Some thoughts just to put out on the table. The first requirement is to try to stabilize the situation, because if you can't talk about deterrence and containment effectively if you have an unstable situation. To get a stable situation, you have to cap their programs, meaning you have to somehow get a halt to nuclear testing and missile testing. You can't get that simply through sanctions, unless miraculously the North Koreans change their behavior or collapse, which is probably not a good policy assumption to proceed on. To get it, therefore, you have to give them something. And here the contradiction emerges. You can't get to denuclearization except within a realistic time frame, and that time frame is probably decades, not months, years. It's decades because it requires essentially, whether the regime changes, the attitudes of the regime have to change. They have to be willing to consider the trade-offs between giving up a no longer necessary deterrence because the threat is going to be removed, and the economic benefits that they could take advantage of if they had a regime that could effectively open up to the outside world, which they don't have. So therefore they can't get the economic benefits now because the closed regime can't take advantage of them. So your priorities have to be stabilization, and that means capping the program has to be out there, and we keep taking off the table key elements that have to go into getting a cap. We say, oh, we can't talk about exercises, we can't talk about this, that, and the other thing, and so we end up with the same contradictions that have for 20 years prevented us from preventing something that was very high priority on our side. Missile defense doesn't do the trick, because missile defense destabilizes our nuclear relations with China and the Soviet Union, with Russia. And that means you merely create a bigger problem in the process of trying to deal with the North Korean problem. The collateral aspects of the North Korean problem are deterrence works. We know that in terms of state actors. But North Korea is a despicable regime, and the more that the sanctions work, the more desperate they become for any sort of cash input or other types of inputs that they can get. That means that as they have a nuclear capability, the danger of their getting nuclear capabilities into the hands of non-state actors who cannot be deterred effectively becomes a big danger. The second is the danger that North Korea is a regime that has no respect anywhere in the world, and therefore to permit that type of regime to continue in a nuclear status while respectable regimes don't have nuclear weapons creates big problems. And so therefore there's no question that the pressures for proliferation will get worse, and we need a more effective way of dealing with that than the simply old structure of the NPT, which in the modern world no longer has a credible basis for it, which is some countries can have nuclear weapons and some agree they won't have nuclear weapons. That's broken down because the technology is too widespread now, and countries are technically capable of getting nuclear weapons now, and we've already seen that with India and Pakistan and potentially others out there. So our prioritization, it seems to me, isn't quite right. We can't negotiate denuclearization because that has zero credibility. We've got to negotiate a cap on their program, and that involves trade-offs. Then we have to live with a despicable regime for an indefinite period of time until, hopefully, changes in leadership, changes in the nature of the regime, create an opportunity to try to deal with them. Is that impossible? Not necessarily. Iran, for example, is an example where leadership emerged in Iran that wanted to end their isolation in a convincing way, and we were able to get the inadequate but better than nothing nuclear agreement with the Iranians. In other words, there was a basis for negotiation. At the moment, we don't have a credible basis for negotiation with the North Koreans. And so it seems to me somehow we have to structure those elements together, but we will merely increase our frustration if we keep putting this in terms of a realistic near-term possibility of denuclearization, which is clearly a long, long process requiring regime change that cannot be induced by outside intervention, but might occur tomorrow because of our lack of knowledge about the internal stability of the regime. But as a minimum, we need to talk sensibly about the issue and not let ourselves get off into these fantasies about we can somehow force the Chinese to force the North Koreans to give up something that they consider vital for their national security.
Can I just say one thing? I think it's outstanding comments, and I'll defer to you, General Gregson and Greg. Great comments, Dave, really great. Two comments. I totally agree. This is not 1 or 2. It could be 5. It could be 10. It could be a few decades to get if we look at comprehensive, verifiable, reversible dismantlement. A cap is the first step. There's no question. But there are deliverables with the cap. There are deliverables because we have a number of military exercises. And I think even the North Koreans allude to it. Maybe you could scale back 1 or 2 of them, and sanctions. Maybe you could sort of give us a little relief on 1 or 2 of the sanctions and so forth. Maybe an intersection in our respective capitals to show that there's some dialogue. So there are some intermediate steps we can take to start to do what we don't have, and that's we have no trust in the relationship. We have absolutely zero trust. They don't trust us, we don't trust them, and so forth. To start building some sort of a relationship. But I think your points are really outstanding.
Mr. Donald Smith.
Some of my questions have been answered recently in this conversation, but my basic question is, what would China like to get out of this crisis? Would they like a denuclearized Korean Peninsula? Would they like the Kim regime removed? Or is their objective something else?
My personal view,
Yes.
a North Korea similar to what Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung, and Kim Jong-un could have, but a denuclearized North Korea, because the nuclear weapons in North Korea will lend itself to strife in the region and beyond the region, as we see right now. But the status quo with the Kim Jong-un government that is respectful to China, that depends heavily on China, and a China that has that 1961 Peace and Friendship Treaty that China is committed to, but a denuclearized North Korea. I think that's what China would like. They certainly don't want, in my personal view, reunification has to be way down the line. Because what they do not, and I think that's fair to say, I think the concern has to be if there is a reunification on South Korea's terms, that would bring the U.S. potentially into the North, and that would be part of a discussion that would have to be separate with China.
Is there a possibility that we could agree to some of these objectives that China may want if we would agree to remove our troops from South Korea?
Well, I'm sure there's a dialogue going on with China as we speak. There's no question on that. But again, when we speak about the troops in South Korea, this has got to be something that's very sensitive to our South Korean allies. Because our commitment is to South Korea, and we all remember the Korean War and what that entailed and so forth. So this is not a discussion between the United States and China, in my personal view. It has to be a discussion with our ally, South Korea, at the table.
Paul.
Thank you. I'm Paul Saunders, the Executive Director of the Center for the National Interest. It's kind of interesting to me that we're a little bit converging on a new version of the containment that we used against the Soviet Union. But it kind of provokes a question from me, because there's one really important, profound difference between the Soviet Union and North Korea, and we've been talking about it for the last several minutes. There was no other state that was willing and able to bail out the Soviet Union at the point when it was ready to collapse. And in this case, of course, there is actually a state that's able and willing to do that, and it has been doing that for a certain amount of time. At the same time, we could kind of take the view, well, we don't really want North Korea to collapse. We want North Korea to evolve gradually over time into a direction that's more open internally, and it's more open in its relations with many of our allies and others in the region. But I also wonder, to what extent is that in the interest of this external power that has the capability to shape, at least to some extent, North Korea's evolution. So I guess my question in brief is, we've been talking about what a frustrating problem it is, and basically saying that the answer is to wait. Is waiting a solution?
No, well, Greg, you want to start at that, and then I'll follow you up on that? Well, the only comment I would make on that, and those are fair points. China, there is that peace and friendship treaty, tip, the lips and teeth, and it goes way back to Kim Il-sung and certainly the Korean War. And China feels they've really invested heavily in North Korea, and they still do on that. I mean, that's the reality, and to deal with what we have. I mean, I think back to the literature on the agreed framework, and there was a sense after the agreed framework that with the passing of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, the government would sort of fade, and there would be regime change, and things would be different. Well, I think we've learned from that. We have to deal with the reality we have now, and the reality we have now is Kim Jong-un, who's on a path to becoming an existential nuclear threat to the U.S., doing all the above. China having a lot of levers, but also China realizing that, they can't use all those levers, because one, I would think China would want to still have some sort of a normal relationship with North Korea where they could maybe possibly influence them, have at least someone there who can influence them. So it's a very complex, a very dynamic issue. But I think those are good points.
General Boyd.
What I'm about to say is dated, and so its relevance may question, but I led a delegation to North Korea in 2009, December of 2009, a small group of members of the BENS, Business Executives for National Security. And it was a trip that took several years to put together, dealing with the North Korean representative in New York. And while I emphasized that what we were about was our interest in matters of national security, and although I was bringing business people that we were not coming to do business, I probably emphasized that a dozen times at least, maybe more. And they never really heard what I was saying. And when we arrived there, and a very elaborate dinner on the first evening of our presence, it became clear that they believed we were there to do business. And so I had to make a very strong statement in their presence at that moment. We have not come to do that. And moreover, nobody else in the world is going to come to do that either, unless we find a satisfactory resolution to this nuclear problem. Well, we were immediately in a crisis. And by the next day, it was not clear exactly what the outcome was going to be. And so I got together privately with the chap that was at the head of their delegation, and I said, we can do this. We can get on our airplane and leave. Or we can stay here and spend the amount of time that we had planned to be here trying to get to know each other better. And faced with that, that's exactly what we ended up doing. Well, I must say, I won't go into an awful lot of detail, but this is probably the most bizarre. I've been dealing with people in various governments for a very long time.
Including bizarre people.
But in the end, it became clear that while they eventually realized that we were not there to do business, the importance of foreign direct investment to them was absolutely paramount. It did not exceed their determination, I think, to keep their nuclear program. Now, remember, this is Kim Jong-il now, and it's a different world, and that's what I'm saying. I'm not sure how. But that was a terribly important thing, and it came through in a variety of ways. I don't know if you can, if you give up on the idea that we're ever going to get them to give up their nuclear program, is there a way we can rationalize their behavior through opportunity to become involved in the international business community? I don't know how to do that, mind you, but we're with smarter people than I here. Is there a way to back off from all of the world of sanctions and trying to isolate them further and further and further, and actually give them an opportunity to become a member of an international community, while simultaneously maintaining a deterrent capability that is present and visible and understandable?
So what you have just given, General, in my view, and I'll look to my colleagues, a scenario for sitting down and having a discussion. Because you made a case, and the only thing I would add to that is if they sat down to hear what you just said, but while they're hearing that, they're not launching a missile or having a nuclear test and what have you, that would be a pretty powerful presentation to make on the foreign direct investment. That would open it up, whether it's a liaison section, interest office, open up aspects to it, showing them that there's another path. There's another path. And, Ambassador Roy, you mentioned it, capping that program, but not accepting the fact that they will always retain those nuclear weapons, but stopping the proliferation, further nuclear weapons, with the goal of eventually down the road to get comprehensive, verifiable dismantlement. But you've given them a path. And I think that's the value of having discussions, and that's why some of us, when we have these track 2s, 1.5 discussions, we get into putting a lot on the table, but that needs to be done in informal official channels, not with former officials, but current officials. Please, Greg.
Certainly, nuclear weapons, missiles, and sanctions aside, this could open up the possibility for some interesting conversations. Yes. This is an extraordinarily difficult investment environment. This is a government that has defaulted on its foreign debt. This is a government that has expropriated South Korean companies, Hyundai Sun, for example. Chinese companies are also having a tough time. They tend to take you hostage. The infrastructure is in bad shape. Investment has to be front-loaded. Of course, we have documented the use of forced labor, prison labor in North Korea's extractive industry, minerals, coal. Perhaps, indeed, this would create the possibility of initiating a conversation on all of those difficult topics. Again, it comes down to the difficult aspect that this is a very tough investment environment. Chinese investment in North Korea has been, if I may say so, more business motivated, based on more of an economic rationale than South Korean investment, for example, in the Kaesong Industrial Zone, which is now no longer operational, or the tourism project with the Hyundai Sun, the Mount Kumgang project.
Yes, ma'am. This will be the closing comment.
Oh my, oh dear. Well, I'm not sure that this question is, or this comment is worth the closing shot here, but I would like to just associate myself with your remarks, General. It's a frightening situation right now to have a North Korea in possession of such extraordinarily destructive capability, but the only thing more frightening than that is a country with that same capability that has absolutely nothing left to lose. And I would really hope that as these negotiations go forward, we're not going to change society, overnight. It didn't happen in the Soviet Union for a very long time. So I guess my question is for this group is, what is the timeline we're working against? Do we have to produce results in 5 years, or is it good enough to produce results in 15 or 20, 20 or 30? But, understanding the timeline that we're working against, it strikes me as, a critical question here.
I think anyone who's worked this issue, and I look to Greg and to General Gregson, but anyone who's worked this issue, and I've been doing it since 2003, realizes this is a long-term effort. And we just need to start building that trust. We need to stop the escalation that we're seeing, and we need to start moving forward and reversing it. And what we're seeing now is just the opposite. It's becoming that much more dangerous because of the proliferation, the vitriolic commentaries, and some of the other actions. Greg?
I think that it's important to continue to believe in transformation and the power of transformation. It is important to apply all elements of national power. Diplomacy, of course, must never be forgotten. Information has been mentioned several times by both General Gregson and Ambassador DeTrani. I think it is very important to have the patience to induce perhaps transformation coming from within, coming from the very people of North Korea, as difficult and daunting a task as that might be.
George Shultz used to divide problems into two types. One is problems to be solved, and the other is problems to be worked. He characterized the second one like gardening. It never ends, and I think that's what we're into now. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Gardening, let's do gardening.
Thank you all for your patience.
There you go. Positive.